Hello, we're going to be in Amos 1 and 2 today. Of all of the Old Testament books, Amos is the most contemporary. And I want to say something to you right now in 1 and 2. This is the judgment of the nations. I want you to know we're very exposed to the concept of individual responsibility in the United States. But there is a corporate responsibility of which we are not informed, but of which we are held responsible by God. And you know, these nations weren't part of the covenant, but God's going to judge them because He is the sovereign of all the earth, and He expects all of His creatures to obey Him, even when they don't have the law. And so most of these judgments against these nations are going to be because of their war practices. Now I'll do one by itself with you. This is the most extensive attempt to date a prophecy in the whole Old Testament. I want to show you a graphic if I could. And basically what we have here is the three ways it's trying to date this. Number one, by King Uzziah of Judah. Now, the very fact it's King Uzziah's here shows the author's orientation toward Judah and the temple in Judah, as verse 2 will show. The second one is Jeroboam the second. So somewhere in the two overlapping reigns of these very good monarchs, very efficient monarchs, time of great prosperity and peace. And then the earthquake. Now that thing's mentioned in Zechariah 14:5. Josephus tells us that it happened when Uzziah tried to offer a sacrifice on the altar in the temple, mentioned in 2 Chronicles 26:16 through 21, and that it was the earthquake occurred when he did that. He was struck with leprosy for doing that, by the way. And so many think that those relate together. There's an eclipse during this time, and some think the earthquake is related to the eclipse. I'm not sure about that. Now, the very fact the earthquake is mentioned, I do not think this is predictive prophecy. I think it's historical. And so the book was written 2 years after the prophecy was given, and he's just saying, I'm trying to date this thing by something you'll recognize. So three major attempts to date this prophecy in chapter 1, verse 1. Now, verse 2 shows the orientation toward the temple in Jerusalem. Now remember, this prophet is from Judea, but he's going to speak to the northern 10 tribes. And so here Zion and Jerusalem are synonymous terms. Now remember, Jerusalem is not built on Mount Zion. The temple is built on Mount Moriah, but Zion came to be a synonym for the whole city, just like Jerusalem. Now when it says the last two verses of chapter 2, God's judgment on man involves nature. You might well see Romans 8:18 through 25. When it says Carmel dries up. Now Carmel is way to the north. It's close to the only natural harbor on the coast of Palestine. I've got a map here today I want to show you, and I'll show you that map. This is Mount Carmel right there. See that little lip right there? Now we're way down south here. Here's Tekoa, his home. Here is Bethel, where he's going to preach. Here's Samaria, the capital. But he mentions locations all over this area. And there's Mount Carmel. Now Carmel means the vineyard of God. This was known for its lush vegetation. And so it's going to dry up. Now we're going to start a series of nations. And I want to show you, if you have a map in the back of your Bible, please turn to your set of maps. We're going to need it today. And find a map, something like this. This is the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if you have any map of this particular time, you'll see most of these nations listed. Let's start then, if we could, with the nation of Syria. Now Syria is Israel's major enemy during this time. Notice that this is the Syrians, this whole area here. Here is the capital, Damascus. And this whole area was controlled by Syria. Now I want you to know Syria was such a power that Israel really had a problem. You can see some of this from 2 Kings 8:12, 10, 32 and 33, 13, 3 and 7. The extensive territorial scalping, if you please, that Syria did to Israel. Now what happened is Assyria was a major growing world power in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. And she defeated Syria, but was not strong enough to possess her land, so Israel became a very strong, powerful state, really by default, Judah too. And that's where we are. Now notice where it says, for 3 transgressions of Damascus and for 4. Now this, we're talking about Syria, or in the Bible it's called Aram, if you please. Now this is saying for many transgressions is what we mean by this. I will not revoke its punishment. God saying there's a point where even repentance won't help. You might well see 2 Kings 23, 26 and 27, where this idea of even great King Josiah couldn't stop the judgment from coming on Judah. Now here we have all these surrounding nations, and they seem to be condemned for their war practices. Notice what it says. Because they threshed Gilead. Now Gilead is, see the name right here? It's the whole Transjordan area. Originally there were several tribes that settled here, but now it's just this area. Let me use the black part. Right there. Okay, now what we think happened is, because of the way the Septuagint translates this verse, and because of 2 Samuel 12:31, apparently this threshing instrument, which is a large amount of wood with iron spikes in it, that a man stood on and was pulled by cattle, or had rocks on, was used to knock the husk from the grain. Now apparently, because all the rest are war practices, these Syrians must have lined up Israeli prisoners and run that threshing machine over their bodies. Oh, heartless people. It's a rough day. Now, notice when it says, and so I will send fire upon the house of Hazael. Now, Hazael is the usurper to the Syrian throne, 2 Kings 8, 7 through 13. His dates are 842 through 802 BC. Now, his son, he named Ben-Hadad. Now, Ben-Hadad is kind of like the name Pharaoh for Egypt. So he named his son after a very common name of the normal Syrian monarchy to try to gain some respectability. So this is Ben-Hadad III, if you please. Now in verse 5 it says, notice it says the valley of Avon and Beth Eden. Now Avon is the Hebrew word for, just left me, vanity. Hosea 5:8. Usually the Hebrews kind of change these names up to make fun of people. We think that the valley of Avon and Beth Eden, which is the house of pleasure, is probably something you've heard of in the news recently. Have you heard of the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, where the Syrian missiles are? Have you heard of a place called Baalbek, where the Israel attacked the Iranian extremists? We think that Beth Eden is probably Baalbek. It's in the Bekaa Valley. Much is being done in modern news about that. Now, when it says the Syria people will be exiled to Kir, we do not know where this is exactly archaeologically, but in chapter 9, verse 7, it says that's where they came from. Now, exactly where it is, we're not sure. Some think it's by the river Kar, but we're not sure. You just have to leave it uncertain. Now, the next major enemy, if you please, is Gaza. Now, look at your map again. Gaza is one of the 5 cities of the Philistine. Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath. Where is Gath? I can't find Gath. There's Gath. So they're the 5 of them. You see them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, this is Philistia, or the Philistines. Now, apparently they are a sea people who tried to invade Egypt from Crete around 1100 BC, but were defeated by the Egyptians. And so they moved to the southern coast of Palestine around 1000 BC. They were the only ones who knew Iron Age technology. They had all the iron chariots and all the iron weapons. Israel had none. They were a major problem for Israel for large periods of her history, and this is the area we're talking about. Modern Gaza Strip is named after this city, the same location. Gaza Strip is right there. Now, notice where it says, because they deported an entire population to deliver it up to Edom. Now, apparently Edom, let's look at that map again. Edom is this whole area down here south of the Dead Sea, all the way to the down to the Gulf of Aqaba. Okay, so this is Edom, and apparently they were involved in a Hebrew slave trade. And these folks would capture Hebrews and sell whole towns into slavery, men, women, and children, and they're condemned for that practice. Now, you see where in verse 8, several of these 4 of the 5 cities of the Philistines are mentioned. And then the next major enemy is in verse 9, and this is the empire of Phoenicia. All right? Notice it's in this color here. I guess it's a tan. And the capital city is Tyre. And, of course, that's in the modern news in Lebanon, as you know, Tyre and Sidon. Now, Tyre was almost an impregnable fortress. It is an island fortress a half-mile off the coast. And nobody captured that thing. It was just too far out in the ocean. But look, they did the same thing. Because they delivered an entire population to Edom. They were also involved in the slave trade. And look in verse 10. I will send fire upon the wall of Tyre. Now, I've got a graphic I want to show you. Here we have the fall of Tyre. It was done by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. Took a 7-month siege where his soldiers filled in the half-mile gap between that island and the mainland. The historical records say they killed 6,000, they crucified 2,000, and took 30,000 and sold them into slavery. Now, notice if you would, when it says in the bottom part of verse 9, they did not remember their covenant of brotherhood. Now, many think this refers to the covenant between Solomon and Hiram. Now, this whole area has been an area of artisans. When the tabernacle was built, Moses hired Hiram of Tyre. All of the cedars, all the beams came from the cedars of Lebanon in this area. Later on, when Solomon built his temple, he hired artisans from the same region. No Jewish king ever went to war against Phoenicia, not once, not ever in their whole history. Now, this may refer to those treaties. You find them in 2 Samuel 5, 11, 1 Kings 5, 2 through 6, 15 through 18, and 1 Kings 9, 11 through 14. Maybe that's what it says. It also may refer to the just lack of love of selling your neighbors into slavery and have nothing to do with Israel. I really don't know. Now notice in verse 11 we're talking about Edom. Now look on your map, and that's that country I told you to earlier that was so involved in the slave trade. Listen to what it says about them. They are relatives. The first three have been non-relatives. Now we're coming to relatives. And these were relatives through, guess who? Esau. Yeah, Jacob's brother. Edom comes from Esau. And notice what they did. Because he pursued his brother with the sword while he was stifled his companion, his anger also tore continually, and he maintained his fury forever. Now what it means is Esau is just furious with Israel, and they're always mad at them, and they're always on their case. And so that's what this is referring to. Remember, have you ever heard of the Rose City of Petra? Well, that was the capital of Edom, and it's still available. You can see it's carved into cliffs, a rose rock, and a little narrow gorge that gets to it. It's a beautiful place, though. Now, notice in verse 12 the words Timon and Basra. Now, Timon is a district, and Basra is a very large city. Now, Basra is one of those where it's saying from the smallest district to the largest city, I've judged them. Now, the next one in verse 13 is Ammon. Now, Ammon, look at your map. That's this area right here. See, it's the kind of the bluish gray, if you please. There's the major city, Rabbah Ammon. We're going to have that listed. Now, Ammon is also a relative of the Hebrews. Now, it's a relative through Lot. If you'll look at Genesis 19:30 through 38, and what we have here is that's where Lot was run out of Sodom and Gomorrah by the angels so he wouldn't be killed. And his two daughters said, we'll never marry. We'll never have children. So they got their father drunk and had an incestuous relationship with him, both of them, and two children came, Moab and Ammon, and that's where they came from. Notice what happened last of verse 13. Because they ripped open pregnant women of Gilead in order to enlarge their borders. Now Israel ripped open a lot of pregnant women. Jericho, they killed everything that breathed. Holy war. But this was simply for greed, not for holy war. And so they're condemned for the practice, not because of their God, but because they wanted more boundaries. Now notice, if you will, where it says, and I kindle a fire on the wall of Rabbah. Now Rabbah means the chief city, and it's located at the headwaters of the Jabbok River. Now look with me. You see this river right here? See this river? The Jabbok River. Now why is that so important? Penuel? Does that ring a bell? This is where Jacob is going to wrestle with the angel all night before he meets Esau on the other side. Now, notice it says in verse 14, the war cries in the day of battle. Every country had war cries. For Judah and Israel, it was connected with their God. Now, notice the last city, the last country we're going to do is Moab. Now, look, if you will, Moab is just right next to the Dead Sea. You see it right along there, okay? Modern Jordan is most of that, all right? Moab. They're also relatives through Lot. Now, it says here, Moab, because he burned the bones of the king of Edom to lime. Now, the Israelis never cremated many people. They did for some horrendous crimes, and you see that in Genesis 38:24, Leviticus 20:14, and Leviticus 21:9. Now, they didn't burn many folks except for horrible things. So what this country did, apparently they either captured the king of Moab and burned him alive, or they dug up his bones and burned him, and they burned him to lime, which means they took his bones and made mortar to put on a building. How would you like to buy a house that mortar was the bones of the king of Moab? Edom. Yuck. Well, boy, they're condemned for this. Now, notice the sound of a trumpet there in verse 2. They directed their troops in the field by this trumpet. Now, in verse 4, we turn to Judah. Now what's happened here basically is that we have come to the place where the prophet has got their attention by saying, oh, it's kind of like in our day saying, oh, a plague on the Russians and a plague on the Iranians and a plague on all our enemies, you know. And then he turns to us. Well, the prophet got their attention by talking about all of these nations. And then he turned on them. Now, he's going to say something to Judah, and they're going to say, amen, Judah, sock it to Judah. She doesn't need to live, you know. Now, he accuses Judah of not keeping the law and of following after idols. Well, Judah would have died if she didn't think this was true at all, although it was. Now, in the last part of verse 4, it says, their lies have also led them astray. Now, the word lies is a Hebrew idiom for following after false gods or idols. You might want to see Psalms 40, verse 4, and Habakkuk 2:18. Now we come to Israel in verse 6. By the way, verse 5 is a prediction of Judah going into exile under Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon in 586 B.C. when the temple was finally destroyed. And here's a prediction, 100 years plus before that. Now in verse 6 and following, he whirls on Israel, and he saved all of his might of his proclamation for Israel. They were trapped. I will not, because they sell the righteous for money. Now this is certain that this is the riches abuse of poor people. Now because of the mention of slavery in Edom, Phoenicia, and Philistia, maybe we're talking about they started selling their brothers and sisters into slavery for money. Or it may be they just sell them into slavery so they could have their labor for 6 years. You know, in the law, Exodus 21 and other places, you could, if you couldn't pay your bills, you could sell yourself into slavery for 6 years. On the sabbatical year, you'd be let free. But we're not sure which one exactly it is, but it's obvious abuse of the poor by the rich. Then it says, the needy for a pair of sandals. Obviously, they were selling these folks for slavery for just a pittance as far as money goes. Now, this may be, remember when Ruth and Boaz wanted to get married, and there was one relative closer than Boaz, and the guy had to give Boaz his shoe as a symbol of passing the legal right? This thing about for a sale of the sandals may have something to do with the rich trying to gain a sense of legality in their exploitation of the poor. But I really think it means just a very low price they would sell someone to slavery. Then it says, look at verse 7. Now, verse 7 is a very difficult verse in Hebrew, extremely difficult. This is my New American Standard. Those who pant after the very dust of the earth on the head of the helpless. Now, you know, the signs of mourning for the Jew was tearing the front of the clothes, letting the hair grow out, not cutting the fingernails, and putting dust on your head. The rich seemed to be so jealous of anything the poor had that they were even jealous of the dust that the poor were putting on their heads in mourning. Now that's a possibility. But the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, the Septuagint, and the Vulgate translate the word pant into trample, where it seems they just grind the poor into the earth. And maybe that's what it means. Now the next little phrase, they also turn aside the way of the humble. Now this is a bribery of the court system, all right? Now, then it says, a man and his father can resort to the same girl. Now this is not the normal word for cult prostitute. But we know even in Judah that there were male and female prostitutes at the temple. This came from the worship of Baal and Ashtoreth coming in from the nation of Philistia. Philistia, that's right. Phoenicia, not Philistia. I knew that didn't sound right. Phoenicia, remember how Jezebel brought it in? You see, she was the daughter of the king of Tyre. And they would worship God in the sexual act. And there was many of these cult prostitutes. That may be what it's talking about. But I really think what it's talking about, since we're talking about slavery through all of this, I think that if you bought a slave girl and you wanted to live with her, that was okay in the law. You had to treat her right. You might want to see Deuteronomy 22:30. But what they were doing, they were buying one girl, and all the men in one family were using her as a concubine. Not so. Now, this deal about the fertility rites, you say, oh, that didn't happen in Israel. I want you to look at Deuteronomy 23, 17 and 18, and Hosea 4, 12 through 14. Hosea says they're making love under every green tree in Palestine and on every top of every hill. Now, they wanted the shade because they didn't want to get sunburned, but every place there was a shrub, they were making love under it in the name of the gods. Can you believe that? This is God's covenant people. Now, notice when it says, in order to profane my holy name, and on garments taken as pledges. Now, the garment was a kind of like a sleeping bag, and you had to, it was used as a as a security for a loan for the poor. But you were supposed to give it back before night. See Exodus 22, 26, and 27, Deuteronomy 24, 12, and 13. Now here they were keeping the garments. They stretched out beside every altar. In the house of their God they drank wine of those who had been fined. Now here's the picture. They were probably at the shrine at Bethel. And that was, of course, in God's name. That golden calf set up in Bethel was done by Jeroboam I to keep his people from going to the nation of Judah to worship. And it was supposed to represent Yahweh, just like Aaron's calf in the wilderness. They were taking the poor people's garments, and they were laying by the altar, making love in the name of the fertility gods, but they didn't want to get their clothes dirty, so they laid on the poor people's clothes. They got drunk on the wine they bought that they illegally extracted from the poor. And they're doing it in God's house. Can't believe it. Now, verses 9 through 12, or 9 through 11, we have the gracious historical acts of God. By the way, I've got a graphic I want to show you on those Canaanite practices. I almost didn't get that thing up. That's the list of them right there, and you can put your recorder on pause and look at them. Now, in verses 9 through 11, what we have is a rendition of sacred history, how God has been so gracious to these covenant people. And what we have here is, he's saying, I've done this for you, I've done this for you, I've done this for you, and you've done this to me. Matter of fact, in verse 12 he says, is this not so, O sons of Israel? What God's saying is, tell me where I've said one thing wrong. Have I not done this for you? Have you not done this to me? Boy, this is almost a legal suit, I want to tell you. The land of the Amorites in verse 10. That's a collective title for all of the Canaanite peoples. The Perizzite, the Hittite, the Jebusite, and on and on. And you can see that in Genesis 15, 16. Now, in verse 12, we mentioned, in 11 and 12, mentioned two groups, prophets and Nazarites that God had called. Now, prophets, of course, we know, speak his word to the people. But the Nazarites were a very moral group. Y'all see number 6, 1 through 21. They tried to live very moral, set-aside lives. They could not get their hair cut. They would not drink any fruit of the vine at all. But look what they did in verse 12. They told the prophets to shut up, and they made the Nazarites drink wine. What a day. Now, in verse 3, this is also a little hard in Hebrew to translate. Behold, I am weighed down beneath you as a wagon is weighed down when filled with sheep. God says, I'm bearing you like a burden on my back in your sin. You'll see Isaiah 43:24. But now, the Revised Standard Version translates it quite different. Here's Revised Standard. Behold, I will press you down in your place as a cart full of sheaves presses down. And that's a possible translation, too. We have a parallel in Isaiah 28, 27, and 28. So we're not sure which way that should go grammatically. In verses 14 through 16, this is a picture of what's going to happen to the Israeli army when the Assyrians attack. Now remember, the Assyrians are the major world empire growing in the Fertile Crescent. And they've already destroyed Syria, and they're going to come take Israel. It's going to happen in 722 B.C. All right, they're going to go into captivity, the northern 10 tribes. Here's what's going to happen. The cavalry's going to run, the artillery's going to run, the foot soldiers are going to run. Look at verse 16. Even the bravest among the warriors will flee naked in that day, declares the Lord. Now what we have here is, you might have seen some of those pictures recently of the Marines in Beirut who have all that padding on them and knapsacks and chest protectors and helmets and guns and everything. Friends, when the Israelis see those Assyrians, they're going to drop all of their weapons. They're going to throw off their armor. They're not going to be completely naked, but anything that can stop them from running faster, they're going to just take off and drop on the ground. Remember the pictures of the Argentines fleeing before the British in the Falkland Islands? They just had helmets everywhere laying. That's the scene that's going to happen to Israel when Assyria comes. Because you see, God's not going to be with them. And they may have a strong army, but fear is going to cause them to run, just like fear caused the Canaanite army to run in front of the Israelis. Friends, God is no respecter of persons. He told them, if you sin like they sinned, I'll take you out of the land like I took them out of the land. They did, he did. And so now the covenant people are going to be kicked out of the promised land that God swore to them because they would not keep their part of the covenant. Well, these renditions of sin, this was a time of prosperity, a time of military success. Everybody thought no one can beat our army. The temples and the shrines were packed with worshiper. Thousands of animals lying ritually slain. They thought, boy, this is great. God said, it's sick, it's sick, it's sick. Because it's all outward. Inside there's no faith and love and justice. You see, God is a God of morality and ethics. And He wants His people to be a people of morality and ethics. I don't care how many outward things you do. What God wants is inner faith. And He wants that inner faith toward Him worked out in daily lifestyle, where we love one another and we work for justice and equality and fairness. Friends, outward religiosity is the plague of man. We need heartfelt faith. I've enjoyed being with you. We're going to do chapters 3 and 4 next time together. I hope you'll read those ahead of time. Read them in 2 English translations, one you're used to, one you're not used to. Make notes on what this means, and pray for the Holy Spirit to lead you. And when we come back together, I think it'll mean much more to you. Please pray for me as I study. I've enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.